1. The photo that never moved. Before we begin, take a moment. If you've ever loved quietly, waited longer than you should have, or carried a memory that never quite let you go, this story was made for you. Subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more quiet truths, unspoken grief, and stories that don't shout, but stay with you. Now, let me tell you about a photo that never moved. The box had been there for years. Not hidden, not displayed, just present. It sat on the top shelf of Lena's closet, pushed slightly to the left, where nothing ever touched it by accident. Inside were photographs from different seasons of her life, birthdays, borrowed smiles, moments that once felt important enough to capture. But there was one photo that never moved. No matter how many times Lena reorganized the apartment, no matter how often she tried to simplify her life, that photo stayed exactly where it was, pressed flat, face down, like it was holding its breath. It wasn't the oldest photo. It wasn't the most dramatic. Anyone else would have called it ordinary. A staircase. Soft afternoon light. Her face half turned toward the camera. A smile that looked convincing, if you didn't know her. But Lena knew. She knew because that photo wasn't taken to remember happiness. It was taken to prove it. She remembered the moment clearly. Standing there, one hand on the railing, hearing the click of the camera behind her. She had smiled because that's what you do when someone asks you to. She had smiled because she still believed that if something looked right long enough, it might become real. That photo became a promise she never meant to make. Every other photograph in the box shifted over time. Some were removed. Some were laughed at. Some lost their power. But this one never did. Because it didn't belong to the past. It belonged to a question Lena avoided answering. Why did I stay? Not because she was weak. Not because she didn't know better. She stayed because leaving would have meant admitting something painful. That love alone isn't enough when presence is missing. So the photo stayed. Unmoved. Unargued with. And every time Lena reached for something new in her life, something honest, something lighter, she felt it there. Quiet. Waiting. Some memories shout. Others simply refuse to move. And this one was still waiting for her to look at it again. 2. When memory refuses to stay in the past. Lena used to believe that time did what it promised. That if you moved far enough, cleaned enough, started over carefully enough, memories would soften. They would fade into something manageable, something polite. But some memories don't age. They wait. This one didn't arrive loudly. It didn't interrupt her days or wake her in the night. It showed up in quieter ways, when she reached for a glass and hesitated. When a staircase caught her eye. When she felt the urge to explain herself even though no one had asked. Memory, she learned, doesn't always come back as pain. Sometimes it comes back as pressure. A steady, invisible weight that asks nothing, but expects everything. She had tried to place it firmly in the past. She told herself that what happened belonged to another version of her, a woman who didn't know what she knew now. Who accepted less because she hadn't learned how to name absence yet. But the memory refused to stay there. It followed her into the present, not as accusation, but as unfinished business. Because memory isn't only about what happened. It's about what never did. The conversations that were postponed. The apologies that arrived too late, or not at all. The nights she waited, convincing herself that patience was maturity. Lena didn't miss him the way people expect. She didn't ache for his voice or replay the good moments obsessively. What she missed was clarity. The kind that lets you stop wondering whether you imagined the loneliness. The kind that confirms you weren't asking for too much, you were just asking the wrong person. She realized something unsettling. Memory stays alive when it hasn't been understood. It lingers because it's still trying to teach you something. And this memory wasn't asking her to return. It was asking her to recognize. To admit that staying had been a choice, not a failure. Not a weakness, but a decision made with incomplete information and a hopeful heart. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought responsibility. Because once you see the truth clearly, you can't unknow it. Lena noticed how the present began to respond the moment she stopped pushing the memory away. Her breath slowed, her shoulders dropped, the room felt less tense, as if it, too, had been holding something back. She wasn't being punished by the past. She was being invited to understand it. Memory, when it refuses to stay in the past, isn't trying to trap you. It's trying to finish a sentence you never let yourself hear. And Lena was finally listening. 3 Evan's late arrival. Evan arrived the way he always had, quietly, carefully, as if timing were something you could negotiate with if you moved gently enough. He stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, not because he wasn't welcome, but because he didn't know what version of himself the room would require. Lena didn't turn right away. She didn't need to. She could feel him there, the pause in the air, the way presence shifts when someone enters carrying unfinished history. "You're late," she said. Not accusing, just accurate. Evan nodded, though she hadn't looked at him yet. "I know." He took off his jacket and placed it on the chair by the wall. The same chair he used to sit in when he didn't know what to say. Some habits, he noticed, had survived them both. He glanced at the shelf. The box was still there. Of course it was. "I didn't come to change anything," he said. "I just didn't want more time to pass." Lena finally turned. Her face didn't tighten. It softened, but not with relief. With recognition. "You were always good at arriving after the moment," she said. Evan swallowed. He had rehearsed explanations. He had prepared reasons. But standing there now, none of them felt honest enough to offer first. "I thought if I waited," he said slowly, "things would settle. I didn't realize silence was making decisions for me." Lena watched him closely, not with anger, not with hope, but with the careful attention of someone measuring truth. "Silence always decides," she replied, "just not in your favor." He nodded again. That was the thing about arriving late, you didn't get to negotiate the terms anymore. "I didn't know how to show up," Evan said, "not without fixing everything, and I couldn't fix it." Lena stepped closer, but only enough to make her words unmistakable. "I didn't need you to fix anything," she said. "I needed you to be there while it stayed broken." That landed harder than he expected. He had mistaken distance for restraint. Avoidance for patience. Absence for respect. "I see that now," he said quietly. She didn't respond right away. Not because she was withholding, but because she was checking something inside herself. Then she said, "You're here now." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't invitation. It was simply a fact. Evan exhaled, realizing how long he had been holding his breath. Years. Maybe. "I don't expect anything," he said. "I just didn't want to be late to this, too." Lena nodded once. "Being here doesn't erase being late," she said, "but it does mean you finally noticed." And for the first time since he arrived, Evan understood. This moment wasn't about catching up. It was about standing still long enough to be seen. For the day the photo was taken. The day the photo was taken didn't feel important at the time. That's what unsettled Lena most about it. There was no argument, no dramatic silence, no moment that announced itself as a turning point. The day moved the way ordinary days do, slow enough to ignore, fast enough to forget. They had gone out because it seemed easier than staying in. The afternoon light was soft, forgiving, The kind of light that makes everything look almost right. Evan had suggested the walk. Lena remembered that clearly. He always liked movement when conversation felt heavy. Walking gave him an excuse not to sit with things too long. They reached the staircase by accident. Or at least, it felt that way. One of those in-between places people pass without noticing. Evan had stopped suddenly, lifted his phone, and said, "Wait, stay there." Lena paused where she was. She remembered adjusting her posture without thinking, turning slightly, letting her shoulders relax. She didn't ask why, she didn't need to. When you're used to waiting, you learn how to stand still gracefully. "Just one," Evan said, "the light's good." She smiled. Not because she felt light, but because she had learned that smiling made things smoother. The camera clicked. In that second, nothing felt wrong enough to question. She hadn't yet learned that discomfort can exist quietly, that something can be off without making noise. Later, when Lena looked at the photo for the first time, she noticed what she hadn't felt then. Her eyes weren't reaching the camera. They were already looking past it. That day, she had believed something simple and dangerous, that being patient was the same as being chosen. That staying available would eventually become being wanted. Evan remembered the day differently. He remembered thinking she looked calm. He remembered feeling relieved that nothing was being asked of him in that moment. He remembered telling himself that things were fine because they weren't falling apart. Neither of them noticed the quiet negotiation happening underneath. Lena was shrinking her needs. Evan was expanding his comfort. The photo captured that balance perfectly. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't complete. That was the cruelty of it. The photo didn't exaggerate. It didn't distort. It simply froze a moment where both of them were already adjusting away from the truth, just enough to keep going. That day taught Lena something she didn't understand until much later. That love can look calm on the surface while eroding you underneath. And when she thought back on it now, she realized the photo hadn't betrayed her. It had warned her. 5. Staying without being chosen. Lena didn't realize she hadn't been chosen until much later. That was the quiet cruelty of it. No one had rejected her outright. No door had slammed. No words had been spoken to end things cleanly. Instead, there was a slow erosion, a pattern so subtle it felt almost polite. She stayed because nothing told her to leave. Evan never said no. He just never said yes. There were plans that stayed tentative, conversations that circled but never landed, promises shaped like maybes, and every time she felt the absence, she filled it in herself. She told herself she was being patient. She told herself love wasn't loud. She told herself that choosing someone didn't always look like choosing. But staying without being chosen changes you. It teaches you to shrink your needs until they fit into whatever space you're given. To speak carefully, to ask softly, to accept silence as neutrality instead of refusal. Lena became skilled at waiting without demanding. At adjusting her expectations mid-sentence. At reading moods like weather reports. She didn't notice how much of herself she was negotiating away until she started to feel unfamiliar in her own body. There were moments she remembered clearly. Sitting across from Evan, listening to him talk about his day, nodding in the right places, while a quiet question formed and dissolved inside her. Am I actually here with you? She never asked it out loud. Because asking would have forced an answer. And answers have consequences. Staying without being chosen doesn't feel like abandonment at first. It feels like hope. Hope that maybe next time will be clearer. Hope that consistency will arrive eventually. Hope that if you remain steady enough, someone else will finally decide. Lena confused endurance with devotion. She mistook loyalty for love. And Evan, without intending harm, accepted the comfort of her staying. He didn't push her away. He didn't pull her closer either. He let her exist in the in-between. That space cost her more than leaving ever would have. Because leaving would have been decisive. Staying meant living inside a question. Over time, Lena felt herself becoming quieter. Not calmer, quieter. As if speaking fully might tip the balance and make the uncertainty real. She learned to wait without asking to be chosen. She learned to stay without being invited. And one day, she realized the hardest truth of all. Being present without being chosen slowly teaches you to choose yourself less. 6. The illusion of endurance. Lena grew up believing endurance was a virtue. Not the loud kind people celebrate, but the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't complain, doesn't ask twice, doesn't disrupt the room. She learned early that lasting meant being reasonable, being steady, being low maintenance. Endurance, she was taught, was proof of love. So when things became heavy with Evan, she didn't name it as strain. She called it a phase, a season, something you survive together if you're mature enough. She stayed through delays that didn't need to exist, through silences that required translation, through moments where she felt herself leaning forward while he leaned away. Each time she felt the ache, she framed it as growth. This is what commitment looks like, she told herself. This is what adults do. But endurance without reciprocity is not strength. It's erosion. The illusion worked because it felt noble. Because patience is praised, especially in women. Because holding on looks better from the outside than admitting you're alone on the inside. Lena didn't notice when endurance became self-erasure. She stopped asking questions that made him uncomfortable. She stopped expressing needs that didn't arrive neatly packaged. She learned how to swallow disappointment without letting it show. Endurance taught her how to stay silent gracefully. Evan benefited from that silence without asking for it. He didn't demand she endure, he simply didn't stop her. And the absence of refusal felt like permission. That's how the illusion sustains itself. Endurance pretends it's mutual when it's not. It convinces you that pain shared quietly counts as connection. But what Lena was enduring wasn't hardship, it was absence. The absence of choosing. The absence of presence. The absence of repair. She mistook tolerance for intimacy. She confused survival with love. And because endurance is slow, its cost arrives late. By the time Lena realized what she had been practicing, she no longer recognized the shape of her own limits. They had softened, rounded off, adjusted to accommodate someone else's comfort. The hardest part wasn't the waiting. It was the way endurance taught her to distrust her instincts. Whenever something felt wrong, she told herself to try harder, to stay longer, to be more understanding. Endurance had replaced clarity. And clarity, once postponed long enough, becomes unfamiliar. Lena began to sense that endurance was not saving the relationship. It was postponing the truth. Endurance kept things intact, but not alive. It preserved the appearance of togetherness while draining its substance. What she needed wasn't more patience. It was permission to stop enduring what was never meant to be permanent. Endurance, she finally understood, is only love when it's met. Otherwise, it's just a beautiful way to disappear. 7. Evan names his absence. Evan didn't speak right away. He had learned that silence was safer than explanation, but that lesson had finally run out of usefulness. "I need to say something," he said, not loudly, not with urgency, just with the weight of someone who knew delay would only repeat itself. Lena didn't interrupt. She didn't brace either. She had learned how to listen without leaning forward. Evan stared at the floor for a moment, as if the words were written there and he just needed to read them correctly. "I wasn't there," he said. not as an apology. As a statement. The room didn't react. No sound shifted. No tension broke. That was the unsettling part, how ordinary truth sounds when it finally arrives. I told myself I was being careful. Evan continued, that I was giving things space. That I didn't want to make promises I couldn't keep. He paused, then added, more quietly, but what I was really doing was staying comfortable. Lena breathed out slowly. She had heard many versions of this before, but never one that named itself so clearly. I wasn't confused, he said, I just didn't want to choose. The words landed without drama. No defense followed them, no justification rushed in to soften their impact. I didn't know how to stay present without feeling exposed. Evan said, so I stayed distant and called it restraint. He looked up then, finally meeting her eyes. I thought being honest meant not lying. I didn't realize it also meant not disappearing. Lena felt something shift, not relief. Not forgiveness, but alignment. The story was finally matching her experience. You left without leaving, she said. Evan nodded, yes. That was the first time he didn't explain himself further. I was there physically, he went on, but I wasn't arriving. I kept part of myself back, waiting for certainty I never created. He swallowed, naming absence, he realized, required more courage than presence ever had. I see now how that made you carry everything, he said, the waiting, the adjusting, the hoping. Lena didn't respond immediately, not because she needed time, but because the truth didn't require echo. When she did speak, her voice was steady. You didn't fail to show up once, she said, you practiced not showing up. That sentence stayed between them, unarguable. Evan nodded again. He wasn't shrinking from it this time. I want to own that, he said, not to undo it, just to stop pretending it was something else. Lena watched him closely, not with expectation, but with clarity. Naming absence didn't bring them closer. It brought the space into focus. And for the first time, that space felt real enough to be respected. Ate the cost of hope. Hope had never felt reckless to Lena. It felt responsible. She didn't cling to it loudly. She didn't announce it or defend it. Her hope lived quietly, folded into routines, disguised as patience. She told herself hope was what kept things gentle. That believing in what could be was kinder than confronting what was. So she hoped in small ways. She hoped that next time Evan would arrive sooner. That the pause before his replies meant thought, not distance. That his silence was temporary, not intentional. Hope became a language she spoke fluently, without ever asking if it was being understood. Each time reality nudged against it, she adjusted, she softened the edge, she told herself timing mattered, that people needed space, that love unfolded differently for everyone. Hope made waiting feel purposeful. But hope also delayed clarity. It asked her to reinterpret patterns instead of naming them, to stay curious instead of honest, to trust potential more than behavior. And slowly, the cost began to surface, not all at once, but in fragments. In the way she checked her phone too often. In the way she rehearsed conversations that never happened. In the quiet disappointment she swallowed before it reached her voice. Hope took energy. Hope took attention. Hope took pieces of her present and invested them in a future that never arrived. She began to realize that hope, when unsupported, becomes labor. It requires constant translation, constant optimism, constant self-correction. It asks you to believe again after every small absence, every missed moment, every almost. Evan hadn't asked her to hope. That was the most difficult part. She chose it herself, believing that choice made it stronger. That voluntary hope was safer than expectation. But voluntary hope still cost something. It cost her rest. It cost her ease. It cost her the ability to trust what she felt when something didn't feel right. Hope kept her present, but not grounded. She stayed attentive to possibility instead of listening to impact. She learned to live slightly ahead of herself, always anticipating a version of Evan that hadn't shown up yet. And one day, she noticed how tired she was, not from loving, but from hoping. The weight wasn't dramatic, it was cumulative. Hope had taught her to stay open while absorbing disappointment alone. That was the price. Not heartbreak, not loss, but the slow exhaustion of believing without being met. 9. When silence becomes a choice. At some point, silence stops being accidental. It settles in, it repeats, it begins to feel deliberate. Lena noticed it not in what Evan said, but in what never followed. There were pauses that stretched past usefulness. Questions that hovered, unanswered, long enough to grow heavy. Moments where a response would have changed everything, and its absence quietly did. Silence stopped feeling neutral. It began to feel directional. Evan wasn't loud in his distance. He didn't withdraw with drama. He stayed polite, present enough to avoid confrontation, distant enough to avoid commitment. Silence became his way of staying unaccountable. When Lena tried to name what she felt, he listened, then waited. Not in confusion, but in delay, as if time itself would soften the need for a response. And sometimes, it did. Because silence trains the other person to adapt. Lena learned to fill the gaps herself, to answer questions before they were asked, to interpret pauses generously, to tell herself that not hearing no was close enough to hearing yes. But silence isn't empty. It carries intention. Every unanswered message held a decision not to engage. Every delayed reply signaled a boundary drawn without explanation. Every moment of non-response asked her to accept less without protest. Silence, she realized, wasn't avoiding harm. It was outsourcing it. Evan didn't have to say he wasn't choosing her. The silence did that work for him. And the longer it continued, the clearer it became. Silence wasn't something happening to him. It was something he was choosing. Choosing comfort over clarity. Choosing safety over honesty. Choosing the absence of conflict over the presence of truth. That recognition didn't arrive loudly. It arrived as a quiet click, like something finally locking into place. Lena felt the shift in her body before she understood it in her mind. Her shoulders no longer leaned forward. Her breath stopped waiting. Her questions shortened. She began to notice how much energy it took to live around someone else's silence. To constantly calculate timing. To decide when it was acceptable to ask again. To carry conversations that only existed on one side. Silence had asked her to become smaller so it wouldn't have to move. And that was the moment she understood its cost. Silence, when chosen, is not passive. It is a form of power. It decides without explaining. It withholds without naming. It ends conversations without closing them. Lena didn't need Evan to speak anymore to understand what he had been saying all along. Silence had been his answer. 10. Putting the photo away. Lena didn't put the photo away all at once. She touched it first. Not to study it, not to relive it. Just to confirm it was still there, and that it no longer held her the way it once did. The edges were worn from years of being taken out, put back, taken out again. Each time she had told herself she was just looking. Each time the photo had quietly asked more of her. This time, it didn't. She noticed that before anything else. The absence of pull. The lack of urgency. The photo had stopped demanding explanation. She held it longer than necessary. Not out of longing, but out of recognition. This image had once carried so much weight, not because of what it showed, but because of what she had poured into it. hope, endurance, interpretation. She had asked the photo to prove something it never promised to hold. Putting it away wasn't dramatic. There was no final look. No deep breath. It was an ordinary movement, one hand opening the drawer, the other letting go. That ordinariness mattered. Because for so long, the photo had represented everything unresolved. And now, it was just an object again. Paper, ink, light frozen on a surface. Lena realized that meaning doesn't disappear, it relocates. The photo hadn't changed. She had. She no longer needed it as evidence. No longer needed to revisit it to understand what went wrong. Understanding had already arrived, quietly, internally, without ceremony. Putting the photo away was not denial. It was containment. She wasn't erasing the memory. She was deciding where it belonged. She placed it in the drawer carefully, not with reverence, but with respect for herself, for the time she had spent believing, for the version of her that stayed longer than she should have. That version didn't deserve dismissal. It deserved rest. The drawer closed without resistance. Lena stood there for a moment, hands empty, noticing how unfamiliar that felt. She had grown used to holding things, questions, possibilities, unanswered moments. Now there was space. Putting the photo away didn't mean it would never be seen again. It meant it would no longer be reached for reflexively. It would wait, quiet, contained, until she chose to return, not because she needed answers, but because she wanted to remember. And for the first time, that distinction felt real. 11. What healing actually looks like. Healing didn't arrive the way Lena expected. There was no relief that swept through her chest. No sudden clarity. No clean line between pain and peace. Healing was quieter than that. It looked like waking up and realizing she wasn't replaying the same conversation anymore. Like noticing the space where anxiety used to sit, and finding it empty. Not because it had been filled, but because it had been released. Healing didn't erase memory. It changed how memory lived inside her. She still remembered Evan. She still remembered the waiting, the hoping, the ache of almosts, but those memories no longer demanded her attention. They passed through instead of settling in. That surprised her. She had thought healing meant understanding everything, naming every wound, tracing every cause back to its beginning. But healing, she learned, wasn't about clarity. It was about capacity. The capacity to feel without collapsing. To remember without returning. To acknowledge what happened without reopening it. Some days, healing looked like neutrality. Not forgiveness. Not resentment. Just absence of charge. Other days, it looked like boundaries, quiet ones. Saying no without explanation. Choosing rest without justification. Leaving conversations earlier than she used to. Healing didn't make her softer. It made her steadier. She noticed how she no longer rushed to explain herself. How silence no longer triggered urgency. How she trusted the discomfort of truth more than the comfort of ambiguity. That trust was new. Healing also came with grief, not for Evan, but for the version of herself who had believed endurance was love. Who had waited with good intentions and learned late what they cost. That grief was gentle. It didn't accuse. It didn't demand repair. It simply acknowledged loss, and let it be. Lena realized that healing wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about returning to herself without the need to be smaller. She stopped measuring her progress by how little she felt. She started measuring it by how honestly she responded. Healing meant she no longer confused intensity with depth. Or longing with connection. It meant she could be alone without feeling abandoned, and with others without feeling erased. What surprised her most was how ordinary healing felt. No ceremony. No declaration. Just a series of small choices made consistently. To listen inward. To leave earlier. To stay when it felt mutual. To rest without guilt. Healing, she understood now, wasn't a destination. It was a way of moving through the world, without carrying what no longer belonged to her. 12. Ending. Turning toward the light. Lena didn't wake up one morning feeling healed. She woke up feeling oriented. Not pulled backward. Not bracing for what might come next. Just facing forward. That was how she knew something had changed. Turning toward the light wasn't about optimism. It wasn't about pretending the past hadn't hurt. It was about choosing where to place her attention. For a long time, Lena had faced the same direction, toward what might still happen. Toward what could be repaired. Toward what she hoped would one day arrive. Even when it cost her sleep. Even when it cost her clarity. Now, she noticed how different it felt to turn the other way. Toward mornings that didn't require emotional preparation. Toward conversations that didn't need translation. Toward relationships where presence wasn't something she had to earn. The light wasn't dramatic. It didn't erase shadows. It simply made it easier to see where she was standing. Lena realized that healing had quietly shifted her posture. She no longer leaned toward people who stayed half turned away. She no longer waited for recognition to validate her place. She stood where she was. And that was enough. Turning toward the light meant honoring what had been learned, without continuing to live inside the lesson. It meant carrying wisdom forward without dragging the weight of self-blame behind it. She didn't regret loving. She didn't regret hoping. She regretted only how long she had believed silence was something she needed to survive. Now, she understood. Love that asks you to disappear is not love that sustains you. Hope that costs you your voice is not hope that heals you. The light she turned toward wasn't a person. It wasn't a future promise. It was a way of being present without shrinking. And as Lena stepped into that presence, she felt something unfamiliar, but steady. Peace without performance. Clarity without confrontation. Connection without compromise. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you've ever stayed longer than you should have, hoping someone would finally choose you, if you've ever mistaken endurance for love, know this. Turning toward the light doesn't mean abandoning the past. It means no longer living inside it. If this story spoke to you, we invite you to share it with someone who might need it. Leave a comment with your own reflection, and tap like to help this message reach others who are quietly healing. And if you want more stories like this, stories about grief, love, and the quiet work of becoming whole again, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. You're not late. You're not broken. You're just turning toward the light.